Hey guys, welcome to the last video. We're looking at the sixth meditation. Just want to let you know I've got two very vocal classes next to me. They're not doing anything wrong, they're just having fun learning in an interactive way, which is great, but I may get interrupted occasionally, so I'll have to pause the video. Now, what are we going to try to achieve today? Well, let me just briefly pop up the sixth meditation success criteria here, and I'll explain to you what we're going to try and achieve. Now, I don't know if you know, but like the cogito and other things, a lot of Descartes' arguments have been implied. They haven't been directly stated. And what we need to do is we need to spend time reading one paragraph that explicitly states the argument made for mind-body, or we could also call it substance dualism. Now, to do this, we could read just the one paragraph, but we'd probably be better off if we understood the context of the paragraph. So maybe the stuff in the first section of the sixth meditation, which leads up to the ninth paragraph, which we have to read. Then we can outline a summary of the ninth paragraph, and then we can actually read the ninth paragraph and reinforce what we've summarized. So if you could write these three things down here, that would be fantastic, and then score yourself on each of them, which would be more fantastic. And then, for me, can you draw a diagram that represents how you would perceive things to be distinct from other things? Just a diagram, maybe how you see or how you hear, but a diagram that just explains how you are able to see things in a distinct way. Okay, now I'm going to try my best to be clear here. Alright, so let's go through the theory. First things first, Descartes is pretty sure that he's established a lot about the nature of the mind as a thinking thing. Refer to previous videos. He's pretty sure he's explained that he can understand the mind more clearly as he studied perception. Right? And he pointed out that as I study the example of wax, I study how I perceive, which involves understanding, so the mind perceives alone, and I affirm the existence of myself, or the I, but I also affirm the quality of the mind and how the mind works, i.e. understanding is necessary for perception, and understanding is one of the things that the minds perform. Alright? That's a good recap. But now he says, well, what about the physical world? How am I going to understand that? And the objects of the physical world. And I'm just going to reiterate, we, according to the study design, are only expected to read paragraph 9. However, you're not really going to understand paragraph 9 unless you understand the context of it. So I'm going to provide you with a summary of the context, paragraph 9, and then I'm going to provide you a summary of paragraph 9, and then I'm going to read to you paragraph 9. Alright? Take a note. So let's start. Okay. Well, he claims that perhaps, just perhaps, the world of material outside objects exists. Because when you think about it, we can apply mathematics to the world of material objects, right? And he says, well, you know, as a subject, this external world allows us to think about how things, not just necessarily the world of material objects, but things in general, can be perceived clearly and distinctly from each other. Now, at the moment, it might not seem important that I say clearly and distinctly from each other, but when we get to the end of the summary, this idea of being able to see how things are clearly and distinctly perceived or understood to be different from each other, and I think it would be better to say understood, is really important, because basically it ends up being a good way to prove the existence of mind-body dualism. All right, so write down, well, objects appear to us, or reflecting on what objects are, or reflecting on this idea of the external world, really does let us think, or make us think about how objects and things, not necessarily just material objects, are perceived and understood to be clear and distinct from each other. That's really important. Write that down. From these comments, he then goes on to say, look, I'm going to develop two arguments. They're going to logically flow from each other. And these two arguments are going to help me consider what is clear and distinct. Okay? Now the first argument is based on imagination, which is pretty easy to get, and the second is then based on the senses. But the senses argument follows from the imagination argument, okay? So first things first, let's go to the imagination argument. And here, Descartes tries to set up a bit of conflict between how we perform imagination, which is performed by the mind, I might add, okay, and how we perform understanding. Take a note. Right, now the best way to get that is to look at a pretty easy and demonstrable form of imagination and understanding. If I say triangle, you can easily understand the concept of a three-sided polygon which has which has internal degrees which add up to 180 degrees. And it's pretty easy for you to imagine that triangle. But if I said chiliagon, and then you said, well, what's that? And I explained to you it's a 1,000-sided polygon. You could get the concept, but it's actually really hard to imagine. Take a note. And from this point of view of it being hard to imagine, we can say that effort involved in imagining things is really high. It's very, very hard to imagine some really complex concepts, but to understand them is pretty simple, right? Hence why I've got a guy pushing up a boulder here, because it requires a lot of effort. But here I've got a guy pushing a boulder up, which is being pushed by a finger, so it doesn't require that much effort. Take a note about the differences between effort required in imagination and effort required in understanding. So, obviously these two things, imagination and understanding, are not the same thing. In fact, they're very different. They're chalk and cheese. In fact, they're distinct. Yeah. And obviously the things that some of the things, not all of the things that imagination relies on, might be distinct from the mind, because they do have different things to rely on, and we'll prove that in a minute. So, imagination does not equal an essential part of the mind, he argues. Take a note. Now, we need to just take this on faith because we're not supposed to read this section, but I'm providing you a summary of it so you get the paragraph that we're about to come across. And he says that it's not an essential part of the mind because if we lose imagination, what the I is doesn't really change that much. You know, I mean, again, the I can quite easily understand the concept of a chiliagon, but it's very hard to imagine it, right? But that doesn't change the I that a great deal. In fact, it doesn't change at all. Now, let's not get confused. The mind still performs imagination. What we're basically saying here is that imagination is not a really integral part of what the mind is, because take it away and what the I can do doesn't change that much. You still get access to what a chiliagon is without imagination. Now remember, the I is the thinking thing, the mind is the thinking thing. So that's why I've said I as in the subject, or the mind, because they're the same thing. So therefore, imagination must rely on something else. He's basically saying it is not purely reliant on the mind, because it's different from understanding, and the effort required, kind of like the mind can easily perform understanding. So why can't it easily perform imagination? It can't. So therefore, it logically is reasonable to suggest that because it requires so much effort, it must rely on something else. Take a note. Now, imagination is performed by the mind, but it also relies on something else as well as the mind. That's important. However, and this is very important, take away imagination, you still have access to the concepts. That's the point that Descartes is trying to prove. Take a note. Alright, so therefore it seems reasonable to assume that imagination must also rely on the body and what the body experiences or what the body can provide. So we move into an argument which is about the senses. And the first part of this argument is that I must have a body which can perform the act of sensation. Alright, It doesn't perform the action of perception, right? That's different. Take a note. Perception is still the mind tying together what is observed or sensed through understanding. However, we're saying here that the senses must, in some way, be something else that the imagination relies on. Otherwise, why would it take so much effort? Okay? So basically, the body he defines as is something that is located in space and time and exists amongst other bodies. Take a note. And the body allows us to experience sensation, not perception, sensation. Take a note. And sensations are involuntary. In other words, I don't will into being my sensations. Take a note. And therefore, this kind of experience and the way that we engage in sensation is chalk and cheese. It's completely different from the way that we engage in remembering, meditation, or understanding. Okay? So, obviously, the mind just performs these things. It's much more accessible, much more quick, right? And it's not involuntary. Meditation is not involuntary. Remembering, it requires active but voluntary processes, okay? Whereas sensation is involuntary, so it must be triggered by something external. Take a note. Alright, now if sensation is external, so must be triggered, sorry, if sensation is triggered by something external, which calls it into being, and therefore triggers understanding by the mind, right, which therefore creates perception, we can have a new definition of what perception is, okay? So we can say that the mind's understanding plus the triggers of the outside objects, not necessarily the senses themselves, but the triggers of the outside objects, which therefore create the sensations, which therefore are sent to the mind, and then the mind marries them with understanding, is what manufactures or creates perception. Take a note. So perception is still performed by the mind alone, but the external objects which are detected by the senses bring into being an involuntary call to understanding, right? And the understanding, therefore, it ties it all together and creates what needs to be understood about the outside object. So let's go through it again. The mind plus the objects which create the sensations which are fed to the mind uses understanding to tie together the sensations in order to perceive. It involves external triggers, sensations, and the mind. All right? Take a note. Okay, so he's well and truly aware that he's kind of contradicting himself because he has in the past said, look, senses, I have a clearer understanding of what the mind is than I do of the sensations because I've been able to reflect on that by studying how I perceive previously. But now I'm reinventing my definition of perception. I'm saying perception is called into being through sensation. That's really important. And it involves a tying together of what I have sensed using understanding, right? So I still have a clear understanding of what the mind is, but, and I'm aware that I've said that sense data can easily be doubted, but now I've kind of arrived at that point. I don't need to accept everything that the senses have provided me, but I don't need to doubt it all either. Perhaps, just perhaps, I can be critical of what the senses are, but still accept that they must exist. Take a note. So the senses must exist, but more importantly, that things outside the world must exist. Take a note. And this is where we arrive at our summary paragraph, which I'm going to try to explain to you as clearly as possible. Okay, so he then argues that whatever is distinct and can be understood clearly from one another must be created by God, so that way it directly corresponds with the understanding the mind has. Right? Now this includes external objects, but also, non-material objects as well. That's important. Take a note. So again, God creates these things because they need to correspond directly with what the mind understands. However, these things, again, as I said before, don't have to be material. They can be material, and they can be immaterial. So, Descartes understands, right, I put C's here because that's kind of what the language said in the textbook, but I think it would be better to say it understands the chalk and cheese nature of, the physical world and the mind already, which have been proven by the fact that he goes through that senses argument and says, look, this body and the body that exists within bodies is triggering the need for me to involuntarily react to what I sense and making the mind understand it. But the mind still is just a thinking thing, right? It's just taking on board the information provided by the senses and tying it together to generate perception. Take a note. So I can clearly perceive now that there is a external world which is triggering my sensation and my perceptions. But that is distinctly different from what I have previously conceived the mind to be, which is a non-extended, immaterial thinking thing. There's a world of 3 dimensions of time and space where my body and other bodies exist, which is triggering an interaction with my mind, but my mind exists separate from that and interacts with it. But as I've defined it before, it is nothing but a thinking thing. And if I can understand through my previous meditations that there is a difference, that difference must have been created by God, therefore proving that the material world is true as well as my mind. And that's why I've said here, God created the distinctive difference, which I have understood, because this distinctive distance corresponds to my previous understanding. That's it. Take a note. All right, I'll say it again. God created this distinction between mind and body, therefore mind and body must be real, right? More importantly, when we say body, we say physical world, right? But God created it, and the reason why I know that is because he created it to correspond with the understanding which I have, which I've proven before. Take a note. This is an explicit statement for mind-body dualism, all right? And it logically goes, again, if I can conceive or understand the distinctness between material objects and my body and what the nature is of the thinking thing on my mind, then they must exist because they correspond with my understanding, okay? And the way that we demonstrate the understanding of the body is A, through imagination, which suggests that the external world must exist because imagination relies on projecting the external things into the imagination. But also we've proven that perception is called into being as external objects trigger the senses, create sensations, and that sensation is fed to the mind that understands what it's sensing and creates perception from it. Take a note. Alright, so here we have that paragraph, and I'll just quickly read through it because I'm pretty sure it will summarize everything we've already said. First, I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God, so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. So if I understand it, it must be created by God. Point 1, premise 1. Hence, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. So, it must at least be God who's making this distinction. The question of what kind of power is required to bring about such separation does not affect my judgment that the two things are distinct. Thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely of the fact that I am a thinking thing. So he's conceived of this in the second meditation, all right? That I, the subject, the mind, is a thinking thing of a spiritual essence or an immaterial thing, okay? But of course, as is proven with the imagination argument, and again his redefinition of perception, or not necessarily perception, but the relationship between cessation and perception, which would be a better way to put it, there's lots of evidence to suggest the body exists, and I understand their distinctness, therefore they must exist because God created them to correspond with my understanding. So let's move on. But nevertheless, on the other hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I'm simply a thinking, not extended thing, and so on the other hand, I have a distinct body. So in far as this is simply an extended non-thinking thing, and accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Alright, so he believes here actually, and this is really important, that last conclusion is that because the mind interacts through the body using sensation and of course manipulating the outside world, that doesn't mean the mind is the body. It just interacts with it because he's conceived of it in one way that is distinct from how he's conceived of the body and the material world. So it is possible that when the body dies, the mind can live on. All right? But it's important here that he doesn't use the word soul. Okay? That's because the action of understanding and everything else, not imagination, but the action of understanding, doubting, affirming, willing, etc., can all be performed without interaction of the body. All right, so let's go to our success criteria. We've looked at the imagination argument and we've looked at the sense argument. The imagination argument argues that there is a clear and very distinct kind of effort required to perform imagination as opposed to understanding, therefore suggesting the two are very different things. He therefore goes on to argue that if we remove imagination from our abilities, I guess, because imagination is still performed by the mind, it doesn't really change what the nature of the mind or the nature of the subject. He also says that because of the effort involved in imagining things, it must rely on something else because it's not as fast and as efficient as the way that we understand something. And what does it rely on? Well, it must be external outside objects. Therefore, he goes to explore the senses and he says, look, it's now reasonable to conclude that I have a body which imagination relies on, because body allows us to experience sensations. And then he talks about perception being, hey, look, there's an external world of objects which creates us sensations, which therefore is fed into the mind where it generates our perception. Okay? So now we have a very distinct understanding of the world of material objects, of which the body is, right? And we have a very distinct understanding of the mind is, which was proved in the second meditation. Follow that logically through. God created things so that we can immediately understand them, so they correspond with understanding. It couldn't work unless it was created that way. Therefore, if I understand the distinctness between body and I understand the distinctness between mind, they must exist, but they also must be distinct. Otherwise, I wouldn't have an understanding of them, right? Ergo, there is a mind-body dualism because I understand the distinctness of them. I can conceive of them as I have done before, all right? And that's all summarized here in the argument. That's all summarized here in the paragraph that we read. Now, if you have any issues with this, come and see me. Remember, it's probably a good idea to do the exam-like questions straight away, and I'll be really honest too. This exam-like question is very similar to the questions that have been on at least 3 or 4 past exams. So really have a go at it and come and see me. Okay? Cheers.